Open your eyes and see through the lies. Welcome to our program, Popular Opinion versus the Truth. I am your host, the Eagle, and I am here with my co-host, Joe. You may be wondering why I call myself the Eagle. An eagle is a symbol of freedom and truth, two things lacking in our nation and beyond. Our goal is to inform others of the truth going on in the world. That includes educating the general population of the nature of politicians and our president, social political issues, and how the media warps the truth.
Today's topic is Black Lives Matter movement in response to the George Floyd incident and the rise in more police brutality awareness in the mainstream media. What happened was a heinous crime was committed in the fact that George Floyd, who was seemingly arrested and apprehended for falsely, for fraudulent currency, was quite frankly murdered by the police officers. They placed their knee on his neck for over 9 minutes, in which in the video you can see that he is pleading for his life. He is saying he cannot breathe, and in the end, his last words were pretty much "They're killing me," and he was crying out to his mother. And then he lost consciousness, and even as he lost consciousness, they still kept their knee firmly upon his neck, and unfortunately, he lost his life due to that event. And in the wake of that, protesters to this day are still out in the streets protesting police brutality, Black Lives Matter, and all of that. I personally believe that this was a heinous crime that should not have happened. However, people do need to educate themselves about racial biases and police procedures and laws that protect both cops and others in these sort of issues. Um, One thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to prosecuting police officers in particular, is that it does take time because they do need to analyze what happened and to ensure whether or not excessive force was used, and if so, what are what is the proper charge, etc., etc. And I also believe that people, when it comes to these protests and whatnot, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement and all of those things, that we do not get overly emotional, because when we get overly emotional, we tend to make um, unnecessary and violent, decisions, such as the riots that you saw going on, and even fighting amongst the protesters themselves. So we need to take take time to think about what we want to do, what we want to happen, and how we deliver the message against police brutality. What do you think?
I couldn't agree more. There is a counter movement called All Lives Matter that's meant to stop the violence of the Black Lives Matter movement. I support the All Lives Matter movement because all lives, including black ones, matter. Racial bias against all races, especially black people, needs to end, and we need to step up to the corrupt cops to do so. People have been doing that via protest, both peaceful and violent. However, the type of violence carried out by the protesters for the Black Lives Matter movement in Minneapolis, LA, New York City, DC, and other cities is not the answer. There have been lootings, burnings of a Target store and police cars, hijacking a squad car in Tampa, and many other acts of violence, which is really fucked up. These acts have basically stirred up a ton of violence between the cops and the violent protesters. This violence needs to end now, before shit gets worse. The issue with the Black Lives Matter movement is that even though it started off with good intentions to end discrimination, racial profiling, and police brutality against black people, it has turned into an excuse for everyone, regardless of race, to start rioting and commit acts of violence.
Exactly. There's so much violence that even President Trump had to enforce curfews in states with protests to protect the citizens. Well, the violent protests at the very least, such as the riots and the looting, like you mentioned before, of the Target and the SWAT vehicle and all of that things. So, it goes back to what I said before, that we all need to just make logical decisions and not act on over emotion, that kind of thing. So that to me is just, you know, doesn't help the Black Lives Matter movement cause at all. So President Trump, he also tweeted about the violent protests, stating these thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd. Any difficulty and we will assume control. But when the looting starts, the shooting starts. 2 points I want to make is that Trump called them thugs because they are acting violently and they are causing chaos. But he never ever once mentioned race. So, in my opinion, when someone is like, oh, he's being racist because he's calling these black people thugs, why are you assuming that he is only targeting black people? Why are you making the assumption that he was being racist and calling out the black people when in many of the videos you actually see people of both races looting and doing all of those things? Of course, in an area where there is predominantly black people, you will see more black people, such as in Minneapolis and in Tampa. But however, in Los Angeles, there is a rather explosive Caucasian population there, and so when you look in the video of Los Angeles looting, you do see a lot of white people doing that. So Trump was calling them thugs, but he never once specifically called out a race. So that is very, you know, unwise, in my opinion, to just assume that he was talking about black people. Second point I want to make is when he was saying, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Now, I will admit that people will say that that is a very aggressive response, and true, it is, but you also had to admit that burning down a target is also a rather aggressive response to everything going on. When the looting starts, the shooting starts, that was more of a warning, because if he just started opening fire on them without a warning, then he's suddenly branded like a dictator or something along those lines. However, if he gave you a warning to not loot, and then you do loot, and then you do suffer consequences, you do not have anyone to blame for your own actions, except for yourself. And in the very beginning, you should not be in a position where you are committing crimes, destroying buildings, especially if they are black-owned buildings, and you're at a Black Lives Matter protest, protesting police brutality and racial bias against black people. So I don't think that that is very wise.
Well said, Joe. And that's the thing about people. They are incredibly closed-minded and uneducated about different races and other issues. We cannot assume that somebody is a stereotype of their race. Sure, some stereotypes are somewhat accurate, and a fair amount of people fall under them, but that does not give us the right to judge them by their background. The right way to judge people is by their words, actions, and qualities. Derek Chauvin, like any other dirty cop, did the exact opposite. A black man was suspected of committing a non-violent crime, and instead of arresting Floyd, he brutally murdered him. He stereotyped Floyd as a violent criminal when the latter clearly did not act violent at the moment.
Precisely. Chauvin made the unethical choice in his murder of Floyd, and in which he stereotyped Floyd as a violent criminal and claimed that he was resisting arrest and all of those things. Now, there are videos out there that document well the scenario, and you actually see on video that Floyd was not resisting at all. He was questioning why he was arrested, which is a logical response, but he was not being overly emotional and resisting because he knew the scenario that he was in. He knew what could happen, and unfortunately, what he thought could happen ended up happening. Now, I think defunding the police isn't the answer that we're trying to achieve here. I think that there needs to be an overall re-education of police officers and perhaps additional training, but not necessarily defunding. What I mean by that is that when you're becoming a police officer, they only require you 6 months of training, 6 months of just learning the basics and all that stuff, and then they let you out. I think that personally that they should go the military route where you have a a more extended time where you had to learn these things. You have basic training and then you have advanced training and all those things. I think that that's what they should do when training police officers, because you can have your basic training where it's the 6 months of learning the things about police officers and whatnot, and then you have additional training on specific issues where you are encountering, say, the difference between a traffic stop and response to a robbery. Those are two different things. You cannot handle them the same way. So we do need additional training for those. So maybe like 2 years or a year and a half, that would be more than enough time to properly educate someone on becoming a police officer. And also the process of becoming a police officer, we do need to be more strict about that, because unless you're a convicted felon, it's rather easy for you to become a police officer. You can just sign up, and if you have a high school diploma, you can definitely join the academy. So there's certain things that they do need to do, more vetting, more testing, not testing, but like a way to figure out whether or not this person is of sound mind, if he has any racial tendencies, that kind of thing. So it should be a more strict and more thorough process. Now, when it comes to defunding the police, let me explain why it's not the best idea. Who are you going to call in an emergency? The same people who are asking the police to be defunded are the same ones who tend to believe that civilians themselves should not own firearms. So how are we going to defend ourselves? Like the 911 call might just end up being a dead end call, and that's not what we want. Like, I'm sure we've all seen the commercial of like someone calling 911, and it was like an automated message. That could very much be a real thing to happen in the future if we do defund the police. We do need to re-educate them. Maybe we can take some of the funding and redirect it to other things, but completely dismantling and defunding the police is not the answer. We need a re-education. Everything, in my experience, almost everything is about education. Like, if you properly educate yourselves on certain topics, then you won't find yourself being in an argument and being proven wrong or stuff like that. So re-education is the main thing when it comes to any of these racially charged things. Like, for example, the justice system, we do need a re-education on that. We need a fix on that. The same thing with police officers. We need a re-education on that, and not necessarily defunding.
Exactly. The reason liberals claim to be anti gun and are against the police is that so they can cause all sorts of havoc without anyone stopping them. They preach prisoner reform, yet want to get rid of the ones who protect us from them? Pathetic. It's only a few bad cops compared to all of the police throughout the nation. Yet liberals, who are against stereotyping, classify all cops as racist, which is obviously not true. They have an unfair mentality of, I can stereotype you, but you can't stereotype us, which is very hypocritical and dangerous to the country.
Damn straight, Eagle. While there are plenty and plenty of cops who abuse their powers, there are also good ones who don't. And I know that people tend to get very, very offended when you say there are good cops. And, well, that's the reality. There are good cops out there. However, not even most, I would argue that a very small portion of police officers abuse their powers and are racist and are biased to other people, but the media doesn't really show them as much as the good cops. If we showed the good ones doing good things, then you would actually see a very different image on the police officers. Just like in everything, there are those who abuse their powers and there are those who use their powers for good things. There's not. I argue that it goes back to the old Ben, the Uncle Ben saying from Spider-Man: "Great power requires great responsibility." Same thing with police officers. You have this power to uphold the law and to, you know, respond to different scenarios, in a just way, then don't abuse that power. Use it simply for the job that you are supposed to do, and you can be compassionate about it. I've seen many times in traffic stops, a police officer will be like, "Hey, you were speeding, but I'm going to let you off with a warning," that kind of thing. We have those, and then we have traffic stops that can end in a very very bad way. So personally, in the long run, if a reform were to happen, then we can all be relieved knowing that the police brutality will be significantly reduced to completely gone. We also need to make sure that violent protests like these don't happen again, and that we don't stereotype each other based on our backgrounds, but rather judge them for their words and their actions. Because when you are stereotyping other people, you're becoming the very thing that you are protesting against. So you cannot protest police brutality and racial biases when, in a sense, you are doing that to pretty much everybody. I've seen black people who are arguably more racist than white people. Like I've seen black people be so aggressive in their assumption of how a white person looks at them or that thing, and whether or not it is racist, we won't know because the black person has already aggressed them and committed the crime of assault. So again, rather than judge them for their words and actions, rather than judge them on their background, let's judge them on their words and their actions, and let's not be overly emotional and just think logical. Now that wraps up our first episode. You can find us on Twitter at Opinion Versus, on Instagram at POVTT_6_2020, and on Facebook at Popular Opinion Versus the Truth.
Don't forget to open your eyes and see through the lies.